Every spacecraft that's ever left Earth has done it on chemical propulsion. The rocket that carried humans to the moon weighed 3,000 tons at launch, and over 90% of that was fuel. By the time it had reached orbit, only 4% of that launch weight remained. Chemical rockets are caught in this loop, where more mass requires more fuel, and more fuel adds to the mass. They're ideal for short, violent bursts, like getting off the ground. But what if a spacecraft didn't need to rely on a handful of short burns for its entire journey? What if it could keep pushing, month after month, year after year, steadily building speed across the emptiness of space, long after any traditional chemical rocket would have exhausted its propellant supply? There is an engine that can do exactly that, and we've been flying it for decades. In 2007, NASA's Dawn probe began a journey towards the asteroid belt powered by something called an ion drive. After travelling hundreds of millions of kilometres, it settled into orbit around Vesta, one of the largest rocks in our solar system, and then it departed to visit an entirely different world. It became the first spacecraft in history to orbit two separate extraterrestrial bodies. But the engine it used for this journey was actually extremely weak. The thrust it produced was little more than the weight of a piece of paper pressing against your hand. What made it remarkable was that it could sustain that power for years on tiny amounts of fuel. That sustained push added up over time and completely changed what we were able to do with the spacecraft. When SpaceX began deploying their Starlink constellation, they built the entire propulsion system around Hall effect thrusters, close cousins of the ion drives used by Dawn, eventually putting thousands of satellites into orbit. But satellites in orbit around Earth have access to something that deep space probes can't get enough of: sunlight. In space, electricity almost always comes from solar panels, which is fine when you're close to the sun. But solar output falls with the square of distance. At Mars, a panel produces roughly half of what it does near Earth, and at Jupiter that plummets to just 4%. NASA's Juno mission was a direct challenge to that. It was built around three enormous 9-meter solar wings, with every piece of equipment optimized around squeezing the most out of whatever light reached them at that distance. When it left Earth, those wings were producing around 14 kilowatts, but by the time Juno reached Jupiter, the sun had faded into a distant speck of light. Those same wings were now squeezing out less than 500 watts, just enough to keep the spacecraft alive and talking to Earth, but nowhere near enough for a high-powered propulsion system. It turns out the engines were never really the problem. 49 years after launch, Voyager 1 is still whispering back to Earth from a region of space where solar panels are basically useless. Yet, it's somehow still generating enough power to keep its instruments alive and send data across billions of kilometers of space. But Voyager runs on only a few hundred watts of power, not even enough to power a household microwave. The reason it's still able to communicate is because it carries around 30 pounds of plutonium-238. That decaying plutonium releases heat which is converted into electricity. But even if we wanted to scale that up for an interstellar spaceship, we couldn't. Plutonium is scarce. The United States produces only a few pounds of plutonium-238 a year. And even at Voyager's scale, most of the energy never becomes electricity at all. Almost all of it is lost as heat during conversion, which really only leaves us with one option: a nuclear reactor. But a nuclear reactor in space isn't actually as crazy as it sounds, because we've flown one before. NASA's SNAP-10A launched in 1965 and operated in orbit for over a month before a voltage regulator gave out. In the 60 years that followed, NASA spent billions of dollars across dozens of nuclear propulsion and power programs, but it never put another fission reactor into space. And whilst a reactor would solve the power problem, it would also unveil a new issue. Most satellites only fire their engine in short bursts. An interplanetary spacecraft might need them running for thousands of hours just to build up enough speed, and that's where the hardware starts fighting back. Ion engines work by firing charged particles out the back at mind-boggling speeds. But a small fraction of those particles don't leave cleanly. they strike the engine itself instead. Over time, it's like an atomic sandstorm, slowly eroding the hardware from within. So if we wanted to build something like a generational ship, our whole plan would hinge on whether those engines could survive the journey or if they'd cannibalize themselves before reaching their new home. For decades, that erosion placed a hard limit on how long ion engines could operate. Then engineers made a breakthrough. By reshaping the magnetic fields inside the thruster, they essentially tamed the atomic sandstorm before it could chew through the walls. Reinforced with hardened armor to absorb whatever did get through, the erosion was slowed to a crawl. Suddenly, engine lifespans began stretching from thousands of hours to tens of thousands of hours to decades. The question was no longer whether these engines could survive the journey. It was whether all these pieces could finally work together in the same spacecraft, and that might be about to happen. Earlier this year, NASA announced SR-1 Freedom, an interplanetary spacecraft built around a 20-kilowatt fission reactor and driven by an ion propulsion system. In December 2028, for the first time in 60 years, we'll fly a reactor in space again. And if it works, it won't just be testing a reactor. It'll demonstrate that the pieces we've spent decades developing separately can finally operate together as a single system.